Hello everyone, and welcome back. In previous classes, we started to see how we can combine the different light passes of a scene to reconstruct the complete image. We also saw that having the light passes separated in the composition allows us to create adjustment nodes that act only on specific passes. And this makes us have much more control in adjusting the images. The scene we used earlier had both diffuse type and glossy type passes. But depending on the scene being used, it may be necessary to combine other light passes to assemble the final image. If we look at the passes page of the Blender manual, we can see which other passes can be separated in a scene rendered with cycles and in a scene rendered with Eve. So that we can combine these passes that I haven't shown yet, all we need to do is continue following the instructions of these schemes shown in the manual. As we have already seen the working logic of this type of configuration, and we already understand how to combine the passes in the airplane scene, in this class, I will only use some files already configured to comment on how these other passes can be combined. All the files I'm going to use can be found for download along with this class. I'll start by talking about the combination of the render passes with cycles. And for that, I'm going to open the file named Combining All Light Passes, Cycles. If I set the viewport view in rendered mode, we'll see that this scene has some types of information that don't correspond to the diffuse passes and the glossy passes that we saw in the plane scene. The information of materials that have transparency, such as these glasses, for example, are stored in transmission type passes. So, whenever you have a material with this characteristic, and you want to work with light passes in the composition, you should enable the transmission passes in the View Layers Properties tab. The information for materials configured with some emission effect, such as this glowing head, is stored in the emission pass. So, whenever you have a material with this characteristic, and you want to work with light passes in the composition, you should enable this pass in the View Layers Properties tab. And if the background of your scene is not covered by any object, and you can see the background that is configured in the world background of your scene, you can enable the Environment pass so that you can combine it with the rest of the image in the composition. The option to view this pass in the Render Pass menu of the viewport is the Background option. As we can see, all these passes are already enabled in this scene. Then I will render the image. And when the render is ready, I'll enable the compositing workspace. As we can see, the composition is already completely assembled. As we have already seen the basics of how to combine light passes in previous classes, in this class I will just comment on how the assembly must be done to combine these passes. As we can see here at the beginning of the composition, the diffuse passes and glossy passes are set up in the same way as we did in the airplane scene. For both diffuse and glossy passes, the direct pass is combined with the indirect pass through a mix node, configured with the Add Blend mode. And the result of combining these two passes is combined with the color pass through a mix node, configured with the Multiply Blend mode. If we look at the transmission passes now, we will see that their combination is exactly the same. The transmission direct pass is combined with the transmission indirect pass through a mix node, configured with Add Blend mode. And the result of this blend is combined with the transmission color pass through a mix node, configured with the Multiply Blend mode. After that, all light passes are blended through mix nodes configured with the Add Blend mode. If you want, you can see the effect of each of the passes being removed, and added in isolation. For this, the ideal is to disable the denoise node temporarily, so that the composition update is faster. To do this, just select the node, and press the M key. Now, we can change the factor of each of these nodes, to see the influence of each one of them on the composition. This last node adds the environment of the image, which is the background of the scene. The previous node adds the effect of materials with emission, which in this scene is the glow of this blue head. This other node adds the transmission passes to the composition, which are the passes that store the material information with transparency. In this scene, this effect can be seen in these glass goblets. And this previous node combines the diffuse passes with the glossy passes. But we had already seen this in previous classes. All this assembly was done following the schematic of the Blender manual itself. Every time this graph has an addition icon in the combination between two passes, we must use a mix node with the Add Blend mode. And every time the graph shows a multiplication icon, it is because the mix node used to combine the passes in question must be configured with the Multiply Blend mode. Following these instructions, we will arrive at exactly this result that I have already set up in this scene. The only thing I added more was the denoise node, which I've also shown how to use. Now, let's see how to use light passes with Eve. For that, I will open the file named Combining All Light Passes, Eve. The way to combine the light passes in a scene rendered with Eve is a little different from the montage we do when the image is rendered with cycles. If we look at the manual, we will see that Eve does not create separate transmission type passes for transparent materials, as Cycles does. We can also see that the lighting is not separated into direct light passes and indirect light passes in the diffuse passes and in the glossy passes. Furthermore, we can see that this manual schematic also indicates that we can combine a pass called Volume Light and a pass called Bloom with mix nodes set with the Add mode. This volume light pass is only needed if the scene has any volume shaders. As this scene doesn't have any shaders of this type, I'll leave it to talk about this volume pass in another file. If we look at the file now and enable the View Layers tab, we will see that all light passes that we saw in the manual, with the exception of the volume light pass, are already enabled. Then we can render the scene. And, after the scene is rendered, we can enable the compositing workspace. As we will see, the composition is set up in exactly the same way as indicated in the manual. The diffuse direct pass is combined with the diffuse color pass through a mix node set to multiply. Same as glossy direct pass and glossy color pass. These diffuse and glossy passes are then combined through a mix node configured with the Add Blend mode. After that, the emission, environment, and bloom passes are also combined in sequence through mix nodes configured with the Add Blend mode. And since Eve's way of rendering doesn't generate the noise that Cycles generates, we don't need to use the denoise node in the image compositions created with Eve. Now we can test the influence of each one of the passes by changing the factor of the mix nodes. If we tweak the last mix node, we can see the influence of the bloom pass. As you can see, this pass adds the volumetric glow caused by the lighter regions of the scene. Furthermore, in the case of Eve, it also adds the transparency information of transparent materials, such as these glass cups. The previous node adds the environment pass, which is the background of the scene. This other node adds the emission pass, which in the case of this scene can be seen in this blue head. And the other nodes combine the diffuse passes and the glossy passes in a similar way to what we've seen with cycles. If we leave all nodes with the factor at 100%, and compare the result of this composition with the beauty pass, which is the originally rendered image, we will see that in the case of Eve, the composition of the passes is not 100% identical to the beauty pass. But the result is still very similar. And the fact of having separate passes allows us to have all the control of adjustments that we have seen in the airplane scene. Now, to finish, I'm going to open 2 more files to comment the volume passes. I'll start by opening the volume pass Eve file. I left a shader editor open in world mode, in the main interface of the file. As you can see, the world of this scene is configured with a principled volume shader, connected to the volume socket of the world output. If we enable the rendered mode of the viewport, we will see the effect of this shader. As we can see, this volume shader creates this fog aspect in the scene. The effect is similar to the effect we can create with the mist pass and Z pass in the compositor. But when the volume shader is used in the scene world, the effect is created independently of the composition. Both techniques have their advantages and disadvantages. In general, creating this effect through the mist pass through the compositor tends to have a smaller impact on the image rendering time. But if you want to use a volume shader in the world of the scene, and you want to have this element separate in the composition, you must enable the volume light pass in the View Layers tab. If we look at the Blender manual page, we will see that to combine the volume light pass in the composition, we just need to use a mix node configured with the Add mode. So, if we look at the scene's compositing workspace, we'll see that I've already connected the volume direct output from the Render Layers node to a Mix node. And if we change the factor of this node, we can control the intensity of the presence of this volumetric effect. Now, to finish, I'm going to talk briefly about the volume pass of cycles. For that, I'll open the volume pass cycles file. If we look at the manual, we will see that the cycles composition scheme does not show how the volume pass connection should be made. But all we need to do is follow the exact same pattern as the other lighting passes. If we look at the View Layers tab when cycles is enabled, we will see that there are 2 volume passes to enable, direct and indirect. If we render the scene, and we go to the compositing workspace, we'll see that the way to combine the direct pass with the indirect pass is the same as in the other components. Just use a mix node configured with Add mode to combine the 2 passes. After that, just connect it with the rest of the composition through another mix node with the Add mode. In this way, we can also configure the intensity of the volumetric effect with the factor parameter. And with that we conclude the classes on light passes. Thank you for watching, and I see you on the next time.